Hi, everybody, and welcome to A Case of the Jills. This is a special kind of coach, someone that I got to know a little while ago, and he is a former athlete. He is a consummate professional. He's been in this business for a really long time, and he is someone that is going to speak to the mental health concerns that many athletes have in our endurance athlete community. This is a voice of reason. This is someone who knows what he's talking about. And honestly, someone that I wish coaches were paying attention to. This is Bevan McKinnon. He is coming to us from New Zealand right now. It is his morning, my evening. And welcome. Thank you for being here, Bevan.
No problems. Absolute pleasure.
So I wanted to start with kind of having everyone understand a little bit about your history. You started off as a triathlete at 16, and which is quite young, and funneled through in were a world-class champion. So tell us a little bit about the history and sort of where you're at right now.
Okay, so I remember back here in New Zealand, one of the jobs that you could get when you were a kid was delivering newspapers on your bike to homes around town. And I had that as a job, and I remember reading an advert in one of the local newspapers about this triathlon thing. I think I might have been even younger than 16. I think I was probably about 12 or 13 at the time. And I always knew that I just absolutely loved to exercise and keep fit. My grandfather was a track and field athletics coach. I was always very, very active as a kid. So I said to my mum, look, I think I can do this triathlon. And it was an Olympic distance triathlon. I remember no formal swim training or anything like that, but I trained, I did it. And since then, I've always been really, really fascinated with the sport. So I raced a lot on and off during my sort of early 20s and so forth, but it wasn't until probably I got back from an elongated period overseas, living in the UK, that I really got into it seriously. And from that, started to progress. And I did race a little bit as a professional, but that was a long time ago, but really only just because I was a very, very good age group athlete. So my crowning glory was I decided to try to win the 70.3 worlds as an age group athlete, and then also Kona in the same year as an age group athlete. So I really dedicated my 45th year of my life to trying to achieve those two goals, and I was lucky enough to win the 70.3 worlds in sunny coast in Australia, and then I went on and won the age group in Kona that year as well. So but that was actually the end of my my triathlon participation career. I was coaching at that point, but that was where I realized the balance between trying to be as effective as I could be as a coach, and also my personal ambitions as an athlete sort of separated, and all my energy went into coaching. And also on the Queen K, as I was coming to the end of the marathon and was being run down by a German athlete very, very quickly, I did dip into the reserves and resources of my deepest inner being. That meant that I just don't have the competitive desire to go out there and test those levels again. It almost, if I had 9 lives as a cat, that was my 9th life. And since then, the competitive juices have diminished quite considerably, and all I do now is train to keep fit and enjoy spending time with my athletes.
Okay, and so how long have you been a coach now?
I would say probably about, what am I now, 50? So I'd say a good 15 years as a full-time triathlon coach. So initially just part-time and doing it as a job on the side, but that evolved quite quickly. And our business now has been self-sustaining and professionally set up for probably about the last 15 years.
Awesome. I think it's so fascinating the way you described that moment of kind of going deep inside, digging deep to kind of that finish line. I think that's really fascinating because I have sort of spoken to other athletes before about that sort of mythical place that you go to when you've got nowhere else to go. We're going to be going on a million tangents here, but can you speak a little bit more about that, and what do you think is there when you go there?
The goal or the prize that you're heading towards has to be significant. I always remember, sort of reflected on my triathlon career as being someone who wasn't able to race frequently, like some athletes are who seem to be able to go out and test their limits on a really regular basis. I felt I was a very tenacious athlete, but I needed to ensure that the prize was significant for me to try to reach for those, those last few percents of physical and emotional performance, because that emotional component of staying engaged with the process when everything's screaming at you to say, stop doing this, is vital to high level performance. But yeah, like I said, I'd set out the goal. I knew that I was in very, very good shape. My qualifying time for Kona had been here at New Zealand Ironman, and I'd done 8 hours 48, which is, for a 45-year-old, is, going under 9 hours quite significantly on what's not a fast course. I knew that I was, there was a high chance if I executed on the day I was going to win. So I knew that that was the case. But equally, I also knew that I wouldn't come back and try it again, because we'll talk about some of the other aspects of the costs that came that year in terms of relationships and work and life and family that balance it. I knew I didn't want to have to place other people into that situation again. So there was a whole host of motivating factors there that made me say, and I knew that, as I say, for a great Kiwi term, the shit was hitting the fan with 5Ks to go. And we were, I remember friends were supporting along the side of the Queen K on their bikes and giving me the least favorable updates of the fact that the athlete behind me was catching me at a great rate of knots. And I had to have this moment within myself that said, if you don't win now, you're not going to come back and do this again. And what you've had to ask of other people and of yourself this year is not something that you can actually do again. So therefore, it is now or never. And I think with that, I was able to access probably that last few percent of both emotional performance, but also physical performance. And I think I only won by less than a minute in the end. So it was very much touch and go.
That's so interesting. I really think that is so incredibly self-aware, especially in that moment of just adrenaline and, that race buzz, and when your whole body feels electric as you're just trying to get to the end there. And that's an amazing moment of clarity. Do you think that understanding that you obviously intrinsically have of the cost benefit ratio of training at that level, do you think that informs your coaching?
Absolutely. I think I was already drawing on coaching experience. I was sort of relatively coaching myself up to that point with some help from another very well-respected New Zealand-based physiologist, Dan Plews. But I think it was just having seen what athletes give up in order to do long distance triathlon, because don't get me wrong, long distance triathlon is a very, very selfish sport, and there are costs that come with attempting to do the sport. But I think watching from the outside, taking my coaching experience, knowing how it had tested my own environment in order to get to that particular point, there are some moments of clarity when everything's going on around you, a cacophony of noise, energy, environment, where you are able to think relatively clearly. It's not all the time, but there are points in an event where you actually have to say to yourself, like anything, they call it the central governor theory, is the brain going to give up before the body? And I was at that moment of deciding, yes, this is hurting, but I can stay engaged with this process a little bit longer, because the finish line was in sight. I could gauge how much distance between me and the finishing line there was. And I did the quick calculation and said, no, I can keep going. And for point of fact, I can probably lift. It's going to come at a physical cost, but the goal is too important to me to not give it that last 5 kilometers of running. So yeah, I certainly don't want to go back there again, Jill. It's putting me in cold sweats thinking about it now.
Sorry, trigger warning. Yeah, I find it really fascinating because, the central governor theory is not something we hear talked about a lot, yet we have a lot of athletes that are brushing up against limits, physical and emotional. I think, in my view, more often than we used to hear about, it could be that people are more vocal about it, or it just could be that we're appreciating their data more on Strava and Training Peaks. But it does seem to me that where once we reserved that kind of point of no return for particular moments of competition, it seems to kind of be extending more into everyday training. And I just wonder what you feel about that as a coach. Do you feel that people are sort of bumping up against those limits more now than perhaps in the past?
Yeah, not probably not having conversations with themselves, saying like, if I can just get through this workout, yeah, I can then take my break. Although in certain aspects they definitely are. The prize of the completion of a workout may not be the same as the completion of a race, but I do believe that people were digging into their emotional reserves far more than they would ever want to admit in order to stay engaged with the training process, because the obsession and addiction to training is overriding the sensibility about whether they should complete the workout or adjust the workout or not do the workout at all.
And so, from your own perspective, because I want to make sure we, talk a bit about what you felt as though your personal costs were, and then we're going to talk about sort of how that informs or how you can recognize those same things in athletes that you work with. But for yourself in particular, and you can, share as much as you're comfortable sharing, but what types of costs were incurred by your higher level training when you got to that point? And again, physical, emotional, social, relationships, whatever you're comfortable sharing.
Oh, absolutely. We need to talk about these things, because I think what has happened with the world around us is that we're obsessed with going longer and harder and training more, doing more arduous events, whatever it may be. There's a fascination with testing the physical limits. Yet, what's happened equally so is that there is more pressure and stress in our lives, in our modern day lives, than there's ever been. And understanding that stress is stress, like it comes from so many different inputs around us, and it all ultimately has the same catabolic effect on the body at times. So we've got to understand that. So I think the things that I noticed the most is in relationships. So say, for example, my general training week would have been probably circa, say, 25 hours of training per week across maybe that entire year. So it's a very substantial amount for someone that was also trying to build a coaching business. And then also not just the physical energy that was going out for the training. Coaching is energy out. We are here to give energy to our athletes, to be supportive, to listen to them. It's in a lot of instances a fairly one-way relationship, albeit that I think there's a lot of personal growth that I get from every relationship that I'm with. But generally, it's a little bit more one-sided in terms of the way the energy is going. But you can be fantastic with the people that you work with. You think you're in nice balance in and around yourself, but there was a persistent low level of irritation within myself across the entire year. It would be very prone and quick to react to the people closest around you, so family and loved ones. My partner, I never would have been able to get through this without her. You don't see the wood for the trees once you're in the middle of it. You think this is almost a normal state to exist in. At times sleep was compromised, high cortisol. I was playing around with different nutritional approaches to training as well, which was influencing cortisol levels. So all of those things come into play with how you can balance your mood. Libido was very, very low through that phase as well. That's something that you'll hear, or hopefully hear more often, from male athletes who are a little bit reluctant to share that information. But, you know, like the common quote from your partner is, "Oh no, we're going into an Ironman block." So, so I can forget about sex or anything like that for the next 6 months or something like that. So the irony, and I think the clarity with which I reviewed and reflected on that year was when you win your age group in Kona, you're actually given the option to return to Kona without having to qualify again to race the next year. I said to my partner in about January or February, I think I'm going to do that. It's a ridiculous thing to not take the opportunity to simply go back to Kona and not have to qualify. And she said to me, no. She said, what we gave last year it affected the relationship in a way that I was able to support you, but you know, you were draining in you know, certain areas of the relationship for us to stay in nice balance and harmony. And it took me about 1 week to go, yeah, I see what you're talking about. So that was the sort of the clarity and the sounding board that I needed to be able to step back, take the training load down so that the overall physical stress reduced. And then all of a sudden, the clarity that you see some of your previous behaviors were being clouded by the volume of training. You see them, as I say, with greater clarity, and you're like, oh, yeah, all of a sudden I'm not as irritable as I used to be, and libido's coming back, and you know, sleep is better as a result of it. So I think stepping out allowed me to look back in and see, you know, what I felt I didn't want to have to go through again.
You're an interesting case study because you started so young. And so I think that even if you're able to sort of look back and conceptualize all of your training and sort of think about the highs and lows of volume and intensity, let's say, do you think that you're able to corroborate, let's say, or you're able to connect the moments of low, let's see, low mood and irritability that you described to those high training blocks? I ask you this question because as part of the research that I did for my thesis, I was able to check out the research of Dr. John Ragland, who did all these incredible studies in the late 80s. And one of the things that he noticed, the term back then was staleness, which is why I almost missed it when I was doing the research. But he was doing this research with high volume swimmers. And he always noticed that their mood tended to drop when they were in their highest volume block. And so, you know, we see this stuff in research, and we talk about it. Yes, this is something that we see in the research, we see it in the literature. I'm so curious to hear firsthand how it is reflected in the actual life of an athlete, if they can also see this in their own training, and really what can be done about this if this is something that we're noticing.
Yeah, I think you could actually roughly put a number to it. And the reason I say that is because if you think of long distance triathlon, if someone's working 9 to 5, there's only so many hours in your work week where you can actually put training in to maintain, you know, some form of balance, especially if there's partners and family and everything else. And now, if you're just 9 to 5, that's great. But if you're 8 to 6, that's even a bigger stress. And if you're a corporate who's, you know, working 50, 60 hours a week and still expecting to be able to deal with the rigors of training load that's expecting you to fit things in by training before work and after work, or 2 sessions a day, or whatever it may be, then that's quite obvious that is far too much overall stress in your life to not pay some costs somewhere else. And so I always sort of try to put it into 3 buckets. So you've got family, you've got work, and you've got training. One of those will suffer at some point when training load, which is the thing we can control the most. I mean, what were our expectations for family are relatively set in stone, the same with our work expectations as well. But we can moderate our training load, but most athletes don't. So we also have not only the fact that finding time and energy and space to fit it into the Monday and Friday is very demanding, but then if we get to a point of training that, let's say arbitrarily we'll use 15 hours of total training load a week, we then spend our 2 days of the weekend back ending a lot of that training load. So we might find that over the course of 2 days, we might be fitting in 3 to 4 hours training on both days. Now this is meant to be, or weekends have always been where people are meant to rejuvenate, but triathletes don't. They hit their highest fatigue training block during Saturday and Sunday, and therefore re-enter Monday having not recovered in the way that they would hope to keep a nice even balance. So, I think it's quite a misnomer to say that, and I think, a lot of the events around the world are telling everyone that all athletes can aspire to do an Ironman. And I say yes, if they know and have the capabilities to adjust in other areas of their lives to do the amount of training required and not have it impact on one of those other 3 buckets that I talked about. So yeah, I think if you were to add up your training hours in the week, it doesn't take a lot before you actually see most athletes had to shift a lot of their work into the weekend. And then, as I say, if they think that that's a way that they both recover from the demands of work, but then add on more training than what they've done in the week, it doesn't take long before that stress recovery balance is out of whack. And 15 hours a week, I think below that, most athletes can probably find a nice even balance, but we're in an era where more is better. And every athlete sees on social media their contemporaries or colleagues or someone down the road who's doing 17 or 18 or 20. And in my case, it was 25. So being able to understand that in order to stay very, very healthy holistically, both emotionally and physically, there is a tipping point, but most athletes are going well past that. So yeah, training volume does matter.
I find it fascinating that we are unwilling to appreciate the U-shaped curve. We've talked about this before. It is something that it is just something that continues to really just blow my mind. And we accept a U-shaped curve relationship between output and benefit on everything in life, from, people have heard me say this before on the channel, from like sunlight to water. We understand that there's a good amount of sunlight, there's a good amount of water. Beyond a certain point, that curve starts to turn downward again, and then we're in the danger zone. And we accept that for literally everything in life, everything we do, everything we are, everything we eat, everything we see. And yet we are unable as a culture to accept that same U-shaped curve when it comes to fitness and athleticism. No doubt helped by certain people in the media that love to sort of perpetuate this myth. We just keep going on and on forever and always. And I'm just wondering, so you and I are in that age group where we started probably without a watch. And then we had our Timex watches, right? Which told us sort of the time, maybe. Then we progressed to GPS. And then after GPS, we progressed to, more and more defined technology and numbers. So I'm asking you, as a coach and as a person who is aware of what's happening in terms of the trend of just going past limits, what do you feel, if any, has been the implication of all of this extra data technology and sort of that looky-loo kind of idea of looking into someone else's training and seeing what they're doing and then kind of coming up with what you think is a good way to approach your training? What is that like as a coach? How do you see that?
It's very difficult, I think. It's probably why the proliferation of readiness tracking, apps, devices, all these different technologies that allow us to draw down data that is objective, that, everything on our wrist, heart rate monitors, power meters, HRV, sleep trackers, everything like that. I mean, that's a great starting point. I'm not to say that any of that data is useless, for sure, because we live in an era now where a lot of my work is remote. We're trying to assess the readiness of an athlete to train when the athlete, as I mentioned before, like I couldn't see the wood for the trees in the year that I was training. And even though I was trying to coach other athletes and probably seeing my behaviors is similar to ones that I was coaching and trying to help an athlete adjust for. These readiness trackers improve the ability of remote coaching situations. However, there's nothing better than just meeting someone face to face. The strongest coaching environment that I'm ever in is when we're working one-on-one with athletes, because it takes nothing to objectively sit back and look at how someone is moving, their behaviors, their speech, their motivation, their aura as such is a great way to be able to assess whether they're ready to do the session that you've got prescribed or not. The readiness trackers are still, dare I say it, some works in progress. They're not perfect in any stretch of the imagination. I think some subjective data alongside some objective data is always really good, but then I also think you've got to have a conversation with the athlete. Now that becomes a little bit more difficult because coaching is a business. And there's plenty of businesses out there that are focused on the bottom line. And as a result of that, sell training programs that are always going to be that magic program. It's going to have more high intensity training because you don't have enough volume in your week to get the benefits, or it's going to be a high volume program because that's the ethos of that coach. But what we don't get is the fact that behind the scenes, we're actually monitoring whether the athlete was even prepared to enter that kind of program, because we'll get poor performance or health outcomes if we don't match the program to the athlete, rather than just thinking that any athlete can choose a program that's going to work for them. So because that's the thing, we live in an era where everyone's looking for the magic bullet. I think even in readiness trackers, people are looking for the magic bullet, and typically the information that tells them that it's okay to train more. That's the thing. They don't want to, like ultimately a good readiness tracker is really there to actually tell you when to train less. But the resistance to the numbers that people actually see is that, I think I can still train, even though my readiness tracker is telling me that I shouldn't train. I don't feel too bad. But then they have calibrated their own personal decision in and around when to train, and have probably done it in the face of every other sign and symptom telling them that they shouldn't. So it's an interesting market at the moment. You definitely, I think readiness trackers help a lot of remote online coaching, but you also need to ensure that we're getting the right information out of the athlete, the right subjective questions, because there is also a propensity for athletes to find that that's one more thing that they have to do that they're not prepared to do to improve their training. It's quite interesting. I mean, I consult to a female menstrual tracking app called Wild AI. And so I have the inner understanding of what athletes, the compliance of athletes actually using these readiness trackers, and what it becomes something that in a lot of cases, trying to make them as simple as possible is actually the key, because the irony is that athletes feel they're too busy to actually spend 5 minutes in the morning to complete a readiness or subjective score. They're happy to do the 90-minute run or ride or swim or whatever it is, but understanding that they need to commit a little bit of time actually assessing whether they're ready to go or not is one of the biggest struggles of a lot of readiness trackers now. So I think finding, if you're going to coach remotely, I think finding a readiness tracker that has the greatest compliance for your athletes, but then also not avoiding what is even more important, which is the conversation with the athlete. You'll find more from spending 5 minutes talking to an athlete than you ever will from a readiness tracker. So it's an emerging market and space for sure. I think everyone's trying to do a really good job on the data side of things, but we're all humans at the end of the day, and I think you're going to learn a lot from just physically having a conversation with the athlete that you're working with.
I think that is, in my opinion, as we move forward, that this type of tracking necessitates working with a coach that is willing to be more subjective and to push harder on those subjective parameters. Since we have so much data, it just seems that it stands to reason that you really have to be working with someone who can look beyond that data and see what it means. with that being said, I know you and I have talked a little bit before about your sort of half therapist and psychologist, as well as a coaching professional. And I just would love for you to tell me just a little bit, or tell us a little bit about sort of when you're working with an athlete, what are some of the conversations that you're having? What are some of the red flags that you're seeing that this person is either training too much or abusing training or not eating enough? I know it must be really difficult to kind of always have to juggle so much information. What does that look like for you?
Uh, well, I've always been fascinated by the human condition. I think that's probably why I got into coaching in the first place. I didn't know it at the time, but I realized that in order for an athlete to train, then balance needs to be in place in other areas of their life. And so I think very early on in any coaching conversation that I had, I think it's been more prevalent nowadays because I'm encountering sometimes some pretty acute and sometimes some chronic mental health issues that the more athletes you work with, the frequency with which these are showing up is increasing. Maybe it's increasing because I'm asking the right questions and finding out more information. Maybe it's because we are starting to struggle a little bit more with the events that we're choosing to do, and in modern day life, and it could be a COVID factor, might not be. Life is changing, but the events aren't. They're still arduous and they're demanding, but other areas of our life might be changing. But I've always come back to the fact that stress is stress, and that we cannot ignore all other inputs where stress comes from: environmental, nutritional, lifestyle, relationship, sleep, all that kind of stuff, work, and then training. So most athletes believe that when they enter a training program, that they're really dealing with training stress, but they're not. They're dealing with all stress. A lot of athletes have entered that program because they want to relieve the other stresses in their life by doing some form of exercise. While Ironman and half Ironman training is by no means stress relieving, it's stress inducing. That maybe the first 20 to 30 minutes of that easy swim or bike ride or run or walk or whatever it was starts the stress relieving component. The brain clears, we feel a little bit more alive. By the time we've finished, it's added to that stress component. So that's a big part of what I talk about with my athletes, is that we're managing a significant amount of stress because they've chosen to take up long distance triathlon. And we can't, and if they did it because they feel that it's going to solve some of the other stressful areas of their life, then they're kidding themselves. We need to start to make sure that we're on top of how's your relationship at home. I can see in the face-to-face coaching situations where someone starts to become a bit more insular, they're a bit more monosyllabic in terms of their responses to me. You can just see that their general mood has changed. And that might be a little bit to do with the training, or it might be the fact that they've just had an argument with their partner, or something's gone wrong in the family, or there's a little bit more work going on in their lives. I've literally in the last couple of days just got off conversations with athletes who have slightly underperformed in a recent race, and when we've dug through the data and the training and so forth, we've come back to the fact that 8 weeks ago something happened at work and anxiety levels lifted and stress levels lifted, and it didn't seem to, even though they solved the problem at work, it just didn't go away, the anxiety or the stress levels or anything like that. And that's a classic illustration, is that their training wasn't providing them the stress relief that they thought that it was. So their bucket had already overflowed and they started to maladapt to the training. So, I mean, these are conversations that when two humans face each other and talk about what's happening in life, then sometimes we can start to peel back the layers of what's truly affecting performance.
I think what's fascinating about that sort of equation as well is that people are reluctant to back away from training, even if they have the clearest signs possible and they're getting it from their coach. They are still reluctant to back away from training. So, you sit down and you tell your athlete, you've got an overwhelming amount of stress. We can see by just what we're looking at here. I can see by looking at you that you need to take some time off. And yet the athlete will continue to try to train somehow in a suspension of disbelief, thinking that increased training is going to bring that mood back.
Yeah.
That's difficult and frustrating. I wonder, I'm of the mind that a lot of times people are using triathlon or any long distance training or anything that brings about a high level of achievement or expresses a high level of achievement, that they're using that to kind of manage something else. And
Yeah.
I wonder if you have that experience with athletes and if you feel that people are sort of hanging on to training or always defaulting to training to manage perhaps something else.
Absolutely. And they may not be conscious of what that actually is. And it may not actually be that bad. It may not be, if we think of it in its most extreme sense like an addict, but it may be along that spectrum, because the other thing about this world that we live in now is everything is quantifiable. So you think of a high achieving A-type OCD personality, each workout can be judged. The success of each workout can be judged. The situation that I've experienced quite often, especially if we're doing some form of fitness test or an execution of a specific workout with particular speed, pace, or power goals, the unmitigated disaster of that session not going to plan in some athletes just highlights the fact that the success of each and every single individual training session has a win or a loss component in their psychology. And because data allows us to try to assess whether it was a success or not, means that constantly, it's a bit like social media, we can actually be given reinforcement of how good we are. And that is I think when I see the fragility of a session that doesn't go to plan and how the athlete interprets that, it just highlights that this is a point scoring system that reinforces an athlete's ego. And with that, it becomes quite because we know that fitness is by no means linear, we will transition through periods of fatigue and adaptation. If we get the nutritional component wrong or any of their other recovery modalities wrong, we may find that we don't adapt to the training. But athletes may or may not know that they enter into this process with every session needs to be better than the last. And with that comes a fraught environment where they aren't able to actually appreciate when the session doesn't go according to plan. And I have lots of conversations about athletes and how this is a process and that one session does not define them. It is a stepping stone along many stepping stones towards fitness. But we can see how emotionally connected they are to the success of workouts, of races, and everything that goes with it. That, yeah, there is an addictive component to watching what they do in a micro way to manage their own emotions and moods.
I wonder if you notice more of that sort of urgency around workouts with the longer length races, like those that are training for half or full Ironman. Do you notice more of that urgency or more of that sort of anxiety around training, or let's say that reluctance to back off from rest? Or do you find that that's just pervasive in the culture in general and it doesn't really matter the distance, it's kind of part of the deal?
I think it doesn't really matter. In fairness, I think you touched on it before. Athletes, even when faced with a severed limb, will still attempt to do that swim workout or something similar. It's a compulsion that once we get on, and look, it is addictive. I mean, don't get me wrong. There's an endorphin response to exercise. It may not necessarily lead to a reduction in cortisol or anything like that, or a total stress reliever, but the body is programmable in a way that habitually, if you're very used to exercising at 6 a.m. when you get up in the morning or 5 p.m. at night or whatever, that it will start to get itself ready for that workout. It'll start to sort of look forward to that workout if it's fresh enough to want to do it. And so therefore there is an addictive component to it. And whether you're just going to the gym in terms of your workout, if it's a body composition goal, if it's an event goal, we know we call them exercise addicts for a reason. And yeah, it doesn't really matter the distance. I think everyone, once they get that habit formed, hell or high water, they want to maintain that habit. And the fear of one missed session or one voluntarily taken rest day comes with a little bit of anxiety.
Right. And I think probably part of that is the type of personality that is drawn to this type of sport. We all tend to follow a particular profile, like you said, that type A kind of personality that's really looking to be perfect a lot of the time. With that being said, you know, we sort of have to touch on something just because it is, for me, it's so important to talk about, which is eating disorder. And the reason why it's important for me to talk about this is because in the research that I did, it was men that had the highest incidence of undiscovered, undiagnosed eating disorder and disordered eating behaviors. I think that it happens for a variety of reasons, that it's misunderstood and also not spoken about enough. And I just like to know two things from you. One, what your experience is with sort of appreciating that someone might potentially have a problem. And brass tacks, like we have talked about this before on this channel, there are some eating habits that are encouraged in endurance sport that are potentially problematic if taken to an extreme. And I just would love to know your thoughts on both sides of that.
Absolutely. It's pervasive. I mean, it's pervasive through society. I mean, we're obsessed. Everything that we're marketed to is about body composition, leanness, in the endurance sports world, you go and watch the best athletes in the world turn up to Kona, for example, and they're skeletal. And, you know, there's a unconscious or conscious connection between being lighter is going to improve performance. And we live in, and I know that from my own personal experience. I'm not the smallest triathlete in the world. I always felt I was too big to be an elite level runner. And so therefore, every piece of food you'd put in your mouth when you're competing had a either positive or negative association with it, and generally negative. So I had to earn the food that I wanted to put in my mouth by doing training, ignoring the fact that as a bigger person, let's say, for example, my basal metabolic rate, so basically what I needed to consume in terms of food to just keep myself and my immune system healthy, was probably in the vicinity of maybe 2,500 calories a day, which is to any human being probably 3 to 4 good sized meals. But even eating those on a non-training day came with a sense of guilt because I hadn't earned them through working out. And that's what people do. They're drawn to the sport because a workout removes the temporary guilt from what they're about to put in their mouths. And you know, there's been a lot of work by Trent Stellingworth and many people in that field that have looked at what are the components of overtraining, what truly leads to overtraining, and it's malnourishment. It comes through all the time: low energy availability, relative energy deficiency. All this is part and parcel of the psychology of what we've brought as human beings to life and then into the sports that we actually undertake. I deal with this all the time. I would say, and hand on heart, about 2 years ago, we really started to promote on our podcast and also within our coaching group the concept of low energy availability. We've been talking about relative energy deficiency for years, but we went to the IOC guidelines and we looked at what was recognized as a approximate value of calories per kg of lean muscle mass that an athlete may need to consume in order to maintain both immune and health and function within the body, plus also to be able to provide enough energy to support the training that they were doing in order to adapt and get better. We audited our entire group and we had one of nearly 40 athletes who we estimated was meeting their caloric needs. So that sounds extreme, but I would suggest that that's actually quite reflective of general society nowadays. When we start to do rough calculations of the total caloric requirement for a long distance triathlete to consume based on, let's say, as low as, and I'll use metrics here, so maybe a 50 kg athlete all the way up to maybe an 80 kg athlete, it's always more than what they would expect. Once you run the numbers, and I think what we've found here is that we've become very used to trying to take in dietary habits that have been suggested over the years and in social media that may help us lose weight. And then we've applied ultra distance training to it, and we haven't wanted to adjust our nutritional plan. So we go, most athletes circa 2,000 calories a day, yet their training alone may have burnt 2,000 calories per day. So there's this massive deficit of where's the calories coming from to support immune function and health. There isn't. So we live in this constant deficit. And I think why we're seeing these poor health outcomes or maladaptation to training is because of this inability to appreciate that we need to nourish the body, we need to fuel the body, and that when an athlete has a highly trained metabolism, that we can eat a significant amount of nutrition and not put on weight. But it takes a very brave athlete to buy into what is a proven concept, because everyone else that we deal with and we see in the social popular press is telling us to eat less. So it's a huge problem in the sport, and it's one that I hope we're starting to change, but I think there's still a reluctance from most athletes to eat enough.
I agree with you on that. I've recently heard dietitians use the term eating for efficiency, which I think is brilliant, because it really does express that idea that a body that is running efficiently is adequately fueled. It is not underfueled, and therefore it is able to, let's say, achieve a body composition that makes sense for the output of that athlete, and also a body weight that makes sense for the output of that athlete. And I just think that is something that we're not talking about enough, is that concept of efficiency. So I'm really, I appreciate so much your candor on that, because I do think that there is a significant feeling of taboo, particularly for men, because it is all supposed to be under the guise of training. Anything goes, right? You're allowed to try all these crazy diets and remove foods from your diet, and tighten things up and eat clean and all these things, because it is considered something that is a training tool, when in effect you are really reducing your ability to not only recover but perform and really be a human. Because I think that's probably not emphasized enough, that person first, athlete second. I hate to say it, but that's really has to be.
Absolutely. Health before performance,
right?
Because you won't get performance if you're not healthy. And in short-term measures, and look, I'll as a professional coach who coaches professional athletes, there are periods where it's unavoidable to be in a deficit. You have an athlete who's training 30 hours a week and is say, for example, a 65 kg female athlete, then her stomach is absolutely tested to its limits to consume a 5,000 calorie day. That requires basically constant eating across the day. But when you're doing 5 hours of training a day, or the equivalent, then that's literally what you need. It doesn't take, there's many calculators available online that will give you an understanding, an approximation. I mean, calorie counting is fraught for disaster, but when we do need to at least get a general understanding of what we're taking in versus what we need, it's not a bad place to start. But men are no different to females. So I mean, I've used the analogy of a female athlete trying to get in 5,000 calories a day. It's the same for a male athlete, and every single male athlete that I know of is wanting to make sure they fit their Lycra optimally come race day. And so it's not unusual to find that I will be dealing with an athlete a month out from the race. I may not have seen them in person, or I may have seen them in person, and by the time they get to race day, it's like, whoa, well, you've lost a couple of kgs, because they see this point at which they're going to show off both their physique and their fitness, and everybody wants to look as lean as possible. I actually found it really interesting, because when Christian Blumenfeld won the Olympic gold this year, everybody commented on the fact that he had love handles. Now, the problem there is they knew physiologically that when Christian lost too much weight, his VO2 numbers, which this is ironic because everyone knows that it's an expression of oxygen uptake per kg of body weight, and if body weight goes down, we expect VO2 to go up. But in Christian's case, this wasn't the case. So he races a little bit, carrying a little bit of abdominal adipose tissue, and get a little bit more fat, because his VO2 and his performance will benefit as a result of it. Yet all the comments were around the fact, how could this guy win the Olympic gold and he's carrying a little bit more weight than what we deem appropriate? And it's, well, he knows better than anyone that he does not care if he's got a few love handles, if his VO2 is a few points higher than if he was just a bit leaner. So I love to hear that story. And it's one that I repeat often. And I've seen other data where female athletes are concerned that said a reduction in BMI actually negatively affected VO2. So maybe the conversation around performance, we need to dig a bit more deeper into. The leaner you get, does it truly improve? Yes. Only power to weight, maybe. Is that truly represented in your data? Do you see yourself running faster? Have you proven that being leaner is actually going to make you go faster? And in some cases, we're starting to see that, no, it doesn't. So I always push Christian Blumenfeld forward and say, does he look like a triathlete? And most people go, oh, he's a bit chubby. It's like, well, he just set the fastest ever Ironman time and he won Olympic gold. Maybe we need to revisit what we think about body composition.
See, and I'm a pessimist because I believe that people will find a way to explain him as an outlier. They'll say, oh, but that's just one person. That's not me. I can't do that. And then, they will dismiss science in order to just perpetuate this myth of body image, because I truly believe that, again, our culture is so committed to perpetuating this myth of body image, irrespective of what science is telling us. I was gonna end this session by asking you about what some of your pet peeves are as a coach, but it looks like we just hit that. I have to say that some of these stories, I continue to hear stories about people who are just trying to do things differently. And I really do hope that we're able to capture more stories of people doing things differently and finding success and lift those voices up, because I am tired of hearing the same conversation over and over again about again, this no limit stuff and no rest days. And, you have your unlimited ability to keep pushing forward. And it's really not true. Not only is it not true, it's dangerous. And, from the psychology perspective, and your boots on the ground as a coach, you're not seeing it play out in training.
No, not at all. I think we have social media telling us, and we'll always pick the most successful people or athletes and look at what they are doing. And in some respects, they could be unique. Like, people could be right in saying Christian is a one-off. There are other professional triathletes doing long distance racing where within the space of 6 months, they've completed 4 Ironmans and 2 half Ironmans. And what we have to understand is that the other areas of their life may be in better balance. They're full-time professionals. That's their job. They're able to sit on the couch and recover more. Like, every time I've worked with a professional, whether it's an existing professional or whether it's someone who's become a professional whilst we've been working together, the first thing that they actually say is they don't train more, they recover more. And these people have an ability to do more recovery, but we look at them and aspire to these people as working athletes and say, well, if they can do it, that's in the back of my mind. I'm not going to do it to their level, but if they do, 4 half Ironmans or 4 Ironmans in 6 months, maybe I can do it. And I can tell you, one of the things that I did at 40 years of age to promote a coaching business, and I was racing professionally at this point, I decided to do 4 Ironmans in 4 different countries at the age of 40. And by the time, so I started in Challenge Wanaka here in New Zealand, and then I think I went to St. George, and then I went to Ironman Korea, and I was finishing with Ironman Wales. Towards the end of that year, I just was burnt out. Like, I could do the training, but my desire to race, as I mentioned at the beginning, where I needed to fire up that motivation, I just couldn't find it. I just could not find it. And at 40 years of age, sustaining, a 25-hour training week across 4 Ironmans in the year, by the end of the year, I was just buggered. And I was coaching full time at that particular point. So I had a bit more time than most to what I thought was recover. But the demands of my coaching were taking energy away from me as well. So I've lived through what I thought was previously possible and found that it wasn't actually that possible. So no, I think we cannot confuse the fact this is an ultra distance sport. It has ultra demands, and those demands are sometimes within our capabilities, but most often some areas of our life have to, I don't want to use the word suffer, but they have to give way in order to do the training that we've been prescribed. So you just have to be cognizant enough to recognize that, or have a coach who can help you recognize that, so that you can at times maybe let your partner know that the next 6 weeks could be pretty tough training wise. If I'm a bit of an asshole, let me know and I'll try to make some adjustments there. But those are the conversations that we need in order to not find that other areas of our lives are being poorly affected.
So well said, and probably a great place to end. I this is such a great conversation. I hope people are taking notes and will listen over and over, because I mean, it's so brilliant to speak to someone who's just really has it dialed, and I truly appreciate it. I would love for you to tell people where they can find you, tell them the podcast, and also websites and or social media where they can find you.
Okay, so our coaching company is called Fitter. The funny story behind that is we spent about 4 days as adults in a room trying to come up with a name for our coaching company, and then couldn't find anything. And then we turned to our 8-year-old son and said, "What's a name for our coaching company?" And he said, "Well, you're just trying to make people fitter. So why don't you call it Fitter?" And we were like, damn, out of the mouths of babes. So fitter.co.nz is the coaching company. The podcast is called Fitter Radio. And our social media tags are on the website as well. You'll find us if you type in Fitter.
And I will link everything below. Bevan, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me today, and I really appreciate it. Thanks everyone for watching, and we'll see you again soon.